It was mid-December, the type of evening when the wind chills you straight to the bone, and darkness swallows the sky by late afternoon. I had settled into my usual routine, enjoying the silence of a modest suburban neighborhood just outside of Portland. The house I'd rented was old, built sometime in the 1920s, with creaky wooden floors and drafty windows that let in more cold air than they kept out. Still, it had character, and I was a sucker for that. Plus, it sat at the edge of a small patch of forest, far enough from the main road to be considered remote, but not so far that I felt completely isolated. That night, I had planned for a quiet evening. I'd wrapped myself in a heavy blanket, poured a glass of wine, and settled down in front of the fireplace. With nothing but the crackling fire and the low hum of the refrigerator as background noise, I felt a rare sense of calm. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet, a silence that seemed to envelop everything in the house, making the shadows flicker strangely. Just as I took my first sip, I heard it. A soft knock, almost tentative, coming from the front door. It was strange, considering the time and the weather. My neighbors, few as they were, tended to keep to themselves. I put down my glass, listening, thinking I might have imagined it. Then it came again, 3 soft, deliberate taps. I frowned, feeling an inexplicable shiver run down my spine. Rising slowly, I made my way to the front door, hesitating for just a moment. My porch light was off, and I cursed myself for not leaving it on. When I finally turned the knob and opened the door a crack, I squinted out into the darkness, trying to make out who could be standing there. The figure was small, no taller than a child. The porch light from the house next door cast just enough of a glow to reveal 2 figures huddled together. 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood there shivering. They couldn't have been more than 10 years old, maybe younger. The boy was slightly taller, his dark hair plastered to his forehead as if he'd been caught in the rain, even though it hadn't rained all day. The girl clutched the boy's arm, her head bowed. "Can I help you?" I asked cautiously. Neither of them looked up. The girl continued to grip the boy's arm, her fingers pale and skeletal in the dim light. When he finally lifted his head, I felt an odd discomfort settle in the pit of my stomach. There was something wrong with his face. It was off, somehow, like the features didn't quite fit. Maybe it was the shadows playing tricks, but his skin seemed waxy, too smooth for a child. "We need to come in," he said softly. His voice was flat, emotionless, almost robotic. I stared at him, taken aback by the bluntness of his words. "Are you lost?" I asked, glancing at the girl who still hadn't looked up. "Please, we need to come inside," he repeated, this time a bit more insistent. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Not can we or may we, but we need to. Something about the way he stood there, unblinking and perfectly still, struck me as deeply unnatural. I tried to tell myself it was just because it was so late, and they were obviously cold and frightened, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to shut the door, to turn them away. But what kind of person turns away 2 shivering kids? "Where are your parents?" I asked, my voice firmer now. If they were lost, there had to be a reasonable explanation. "They'll be here soon," the boy answered. His gaze bore into me, unblinking. I felt an irrational urge to back away, but I stayed rooted in place. "Why don't I call someone?" I offered, feeling a sudden wave of pity mingled with unease. I didn't want to leave them out there, but I also didn't want to let them in. "I can call your parents, or—" "No," he interrupted, shaking his head slowly. "No phone. We just need to come inside." The way he said it, so calmly, made my skin crawl. I looked at the girl, hoping for some sign of distress, something that would tell me this was just a normal situation and not whatever this felt like. But she remained silent, her head still bowed. The only sound was the low howl of wind sweeping through the trees behind them. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice wavering, "but I can't let you in. I can call the police for you if you—" "No!" The girl's head snapped up so suddenly that I took an involuntary step back. Her face was ghostly pale, almost translucent in the weak light. And her eyes— I froze, the words dying in my throat. Her eyes were pitch black. Not just the pupils. Every part of them was a solid, inky black, like two bottomless pits. I felt my heart hammering in my chest as I stared, unable to look away. "Please let us in," she whispered, her voice a fragile, wavering thing that seemed to echo in my head. "We won't hurt you. We promise." I took another step back, my hand gripping the edge of the door, as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Something deep and primal in me recoiled. A survival instinct that screamed at me to shut the door, to lock it and never look back. "I'm sorry," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "I can't let you in." The boy's expression didn't change. He just stared at me with those blank, empty eyes, his mouth set in a thin, tight line. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he reached out a hand, pressing his small palm against the doorframe. "We'll come in another time," he murmured. Then he turned, taking the girl's hand, and together they stepped off the porch, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring out into the empty yard, my heart still racing. It wasn't until the cold seeped into my bones that I finally moved, slamming the door shut and locking it. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the door. What the hell had I just seen? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I checked and rechecked the locks on every window and door, drawing every curtain tight. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a strange illusion brought on by the shadows and the darkness. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Those eyes, I'd never seen anything like them. And the way they had spoken, the calm, flat certainty in their voices, sent a shiver down my spine even now. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, jolted me awake. I found myself staring at the front door, half expecting to see them standing there again, waiting. But the night passed without incident, and by morning, I almost convinced myself it had all been some bizarre, waking nightmare. Almost. But something inside me knew I would see them again. They had promised, after all. And when they came back, I had a horrible feeling they wouldn't take no for an answer. The days that followed were eerily normal, at least on the surface. I went to work, ran errands, and tried to keep busy, pushing thoughts of that strange night as far back in my mind as possible. It wasn't difficult at first. In the daylight, it was easy to convince myself that I had overreacted, that the kids were just lost or playing a prank. But at night, when the shadows crept back and the house settled into silence, my mind would inevitably wander back to those black, bottomless eyes. 3 nights after the encounter, I found myself standing at the window in the living room, staring out into the darkened yard. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe to see a shadow darting through the trees or a glimpse of small figures standing at the edge of the porch. But there was nothing, just the faint outline of bare branches swaying in the wind. I shook myself and turned away. I needed to stop this. I needed to stop thinking about them. If they were going to come back, I'd deal with it then. Obsessing over it wouldn't help. But just as I was heading upstairs to bed, I heard it again. 3 soft, deliberate knocks on the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, listening. The knocks were quieter than last time, almost as if they were testing, waiting to see if I'd respond. Every instinct told me to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. But the urge to look was overwhelming. With trembling hands, I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I strained to listen, hoping, praying, that I'd hear the sounds of kids laughing, maybe whispering to each other. Anything that would make this feel normal. Silence. I inched closer, my fingers brushing the doorknob. And then I remembered the peephole. It had been installed at some point, probably by the previous tenant, and in my anxiety that night I hadn't even thought to use it. I took a deep breath, slowly leaned forward, and peered through. My heart nearly stopped. They were back. The same 2 children stood on my porch, their faces pale and expressionless. The boy was directly in front of the door, staring straight into the peephole as if he knew I was there. His eyes, those horrifying black orbs, seemed to bore into me, making it feel like I was the one being watched. The girl stood just behind him, her face partially hidden by the boy's shoulder. I could only see a sliver of her face, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. She was smiling, a small, chilling smile that didn't touch the rest of her face. "Let us in," the boy whispered, his voice muffled through the door. I jerked back, heart hammering. Had he seen me? Could he see me through the peephole? I stumbled back, trying to think, trying to breathe. No, I had to stay calm. Couldn't let them in. Whatever they were, whoever they were not normal kids. "Please, we're so cold," the girl whimpered. "It's so dark out here." The way she said it, the way her voice trembled, almost made me reconsider. Almost. But then I remembered those eyes. Those empty, soulless eyes. There was no emotion in them. Just emptiness. "I can't," I choked out, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I can't let you in." For a moment there was silence. Then, without a word, they turned and stepped off the porch. Just like last time. No argument, no pleading. They simply left. I stood there, staring at the empty space where they had been, my mind racing. Why hadn't they insisted? Why hadn't they pushed harder? A normal child, hell, a normal person would have argued, cried, done something. But these kids, they just left. As if they knew something I didn't. For hours, I sat in the living room, the lights blazing, my eyes glued to the front door. But they didn't come back. The house remained silent, the night stretching on into a bleak, oppressive stillness. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I barely made it through work, my mind drifting back to those faces, those eyes, again and again. When I got home, I half expected to find them waiting for me. But the yard was empty, and the house was just as I'd left it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching. That somehow, somewhere, they were out there waiting for the right moment. That evening, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I called the police. I don't know what I expected, a patrol car, maybe, or an officer to come by and take a statement. But what I got was something entirely different. When I explained what had happened, the dispatcher's voice shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Black-eyed children?" she asked quietly. My heart skipped a beat. "Why, yes. How did you?" There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "It's probably nothing. A prank. But we'll send someone to drive by your neighborhood tonight, just in case." I wanted to press her, to ask her why she had used that phrase. but something in her tone stopped me. Instead, I just thanked her and hung up, feeling more unsettled than ever. True to their word, a squad car drove by twice that night. But I didn't see the kids again. Not that night or the night after. For a while, I dared to hope that it was over. Maybe they had moved on, found some other poor soul to torment. But the sense of unease lingered, a constant weight in the back of my mind. And then, a week later, I found the note. It was a small piece of paper, tucked into the corner of my front door. I almost missed it in my hurry to leave for work. There was no name, no greeting, just 2 words, written in a careful, childlike scrawl. Missed you. The breath caught in my throat as I stared at the note, my hands shaking. I looked around, half expecting to see them standing at the edge of the yard, grinning at me. But the street was empty, the neighborhood silent. I crumpled the note and shoved it into my pocket, my pulse racing. They hadn't given up. They were watching, waiting, and I knew, deep down I knew, that the next time they came I wouldn't be able to stop them, because they weren't just looking for shelter. They were looking for permission, and I was terrified I might give it to them. That note haunted me. It wasn't just the message, but the implication behind it. They had been here. They had stood at my door, close enough to leave that note without making a sound. The thought of them silently lurking outside, watching, waiting, filled me with a dread that I couldn't shake. It was more than unsettling. It was paralyzing. But fear wasn't going to help me. If I wanted to understand what I was dealing with, I needed information. Anything that could explain who or what these children were. So, instead of running from it, I dove headfirst into research. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, and typed in a phrase that made my skin crawl. Black-eyed children. I half expected nothing to come up, some obscure rumor or maybe a single post buried in an old forum. But what I found was far worse. There were hundreds of stories, from all over the country, from people of every background, men and women, young and old, each one recounting the same eerie encounter. Children with pitch-black eyes appearing on doorsteps late at night, asking to be let in. Some approached parked cars, others knocked on windows, and a few, like mine, came straight to front doors. And in each account, the people described the same overwhelming sense of dread, a gut instinct that something was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. I read story after story, my hands trembling as the details piled up. The children always appeared in pairs, a boy and a girl, never more, never less. Their ages varied, but they always seemed a little too mature for their supposed years. Their language precise, emotionless. But what really caught my attention was the overwhelming similarity in the behaviors. They never demanded entrance. They always asked, softly, politely, repeating that they needed to come inside. It was never clear what happened if they were allowed in. Some stories ended abruptly, with the narrator trailing off or simply refusing to talk about what came after. A few mentioned sudden illnesses, streaks of bad luck, even unexplained deaths in the family. But in the end, every person who encountered them seemed haunted, as if the children left a mark that couldn't be erased. The more I read, the more terrified I became. I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see them standing at the edge of my kitchen, their faces blank and their eyes, those awful, hollow eyes, staring at me. It was past midnight when I finally found something that made me pause. It was a comment, buried deep in a long thread about these children. Most people were sharing their encounters, arguing about whether they were real or just some modern urban legend. But this comment, it was different. Whatever you do, don't let them in. They need permission to enter. Once they have it, you're theirs. I read the words over and over, my heart pounding. It seemed absurd. Permission, like some sort of vampire myth. But the more I thought about it, the more it made a sick kind of sense. They needed to be invited. That's why they never forced their way in. That's why they always asked. But why? I shut the laptop, my head spinning. It felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't comprehend. Something far darker than I had imagined. Whatever these children were, they weren't human. At least not anymore. And they were playing by rules I didn't understand. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone who might know more than me. But who could I ask? The police wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed myself. And yet, there was one option. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I called. The phone rang twice before a sleepy voice answered on the other end. Hello. It was Carla, my best friend from college. We hadn't spoken in months, but she had always been the one person I could count on when things got bad. And right now, I needed her. Carla. It's me, I whispered, feeling absurdly paranoid even in the safety of my own home. I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep an open mind. God, Sarah, it's 3 a.m. Is everything okay? She asked, suddenly sounding more awake. What's going on? I hesitated, trying to find the right words. How do you tell someone you think you're being stalked by supernatural children? I've been having visitors, I began slowly. Children. They've been showing up at my door. And, Carla, I know this sounds crazy, but they're not normal. What do you mean, not normal? She asked, her tone shifting to concern. Like, are they threatening you? Should I call someone? No, I said quickly. I mean, yes, kind of. They have these eyes, Carla. Black eyes. Completely black. And they keep asking to come in. It's like they're waiting for me to invite them. There was a long silence. For a moment, I thought she might hang up, or laugh, or tell me I was imagining things. But then she sighed softly. You're not the first person to tell me something like this. My heart skipped a beat. What? I used to hear stories like that all the time back home. Small town stuff, people seeing weird things out in the woods. My grandmother used to say that some spirits, some beings need permission to cross over a threshold. Once they have it, they can do whatever they want. She called them the hollow ones, said they were drawn to people who were vulnerable, people who had opened some sort of door without realizing it. What do you mean, opened a door? I don't know, Sarah, she said, sounding frustrated. It could be anything. Moving into a new place, going through a trauma, even just being alone. It's like something about you catches their attention. And once they've noticed you, it's hard to get rid of them. I felt a cold, sinking sensation in my stomach. So what do I do? How do I get rid of them? I'm not sure, she admitted softly. My grandmother always said the only thing you can do is refuse them. Never let them in. Never give them what they're asking for. My mind raced. Could it really be that simple? Just keep saying no? But what if I slipped? What if, in a moment of weakness or fear, I gave them what they wanted? Sarah, Carla's voice was low, urgent. Whatever happens, promise me you won't let them in. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, don't let them inside. I promise, I whispered, my throat tight. We hung up, and I sat there in the dark, the silence pressing in around me. I wanted to believe Carla, to believe that I could outlast them, that if I just kept saying no, they'd go away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple, because they weren't just going to ask. They were going to wear me down. They were going to keep coming, keep pushing until I broke. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to hold out. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and paranoia. I jumped at every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the windows. I hadn't seen them since that second visit, but I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. I took Carla's warning to heart. I triple-checked the locks on every door and window, added more deadbolts to the front and back doors, and even went as far as installing a security camera above the porch. I wasn't sure what I expected it to capture. Blurry footage of small figures in the night, or nothing at all. But I needed to do something, anything, to feel like I was in control. The first 2 nights after our phone call were quiet. I monitored the camera feed obsessively, constantly checking my phone for any alerts, any movement. I didn't sleep much, and when I did, I dreamed of those black eyes staring at me through windows, pressing up against the glass, whispering for me to let them in. But the third night was different. It started with a soft chime from my phone, a notification from the camera app. There was movement on my front porch. My heart leapt into my throat. I scrambled for the phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I tapped the screen, bringing up the live feed. There they were. The boy stood at the very edge of the porch, just out of reach of the camera's overhead light. His head was tilted up slightly, his face shadowed, but I could see his eyes. 2 dark, soulless voids staring directly into the camera, as if he knew I was watching. The girl was beside him, half hidden behind his shoulder. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was staring at the front door, her hand lifted as if she were about to knock. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I reached for my keys, wondering if I should go out there, try to confront them. But what would I even say? What could I possibly do? As if sensing my hesitation, the boy's mouth twisted into a small, knowing smile. Then he took a step closer, his hand lifting to point directly at the camera. My phone screen flickered, the image distorting for just a second. When it cleared, the porch was empty. I blinked, staring at the empty feed. They were gone. Just like that. No footsteps, no retreating figures, nothing. I rewound the footage, replaying it over and over, but it was the same every time. The boy pointing, the screen glitching, and then emptiness. I turned off the app, my hands trembling. My first instinct was to delete the video, to erase any trace of what I'd seen. But I forced myself to keep it. I needed proof. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I needed to know I wasn't going insane. I barely slept that night. Every few hours, I would check the camera feed, my eyes gritty and sore from staring at the screen. But there was no more movement. By dawn, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But I knew better. I knew they had been there. The following night, I tried to distract myself, turning on every light in the house and blasting music to keep the silence at bay. I watched TV until my eyes burned, flipping through channels mindlessly, anything to keep myself from staring at the door. And then, just after midnight, I heard it again. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. My body went rigid, every muscle tensing as if I'd been hit with an electric current. I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the front door. "Let us in." The voice was barely audible, a soft murmur that seemed to drift through the wood and into the room. It was the boy, I knew it. His voice was low, calm, almost soothing. "Please, we're so cold. Just for a minute. We won't stay long." I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I knew what I had to do. Ignore them. Don't respond. Don't engage. But it was so hard. There was something in his voice, something that made it sound almost reasonable, as if I should let them in, as if it were the natural, sensible thing to do. We're not bad, the boy whispered. We just want to come inside. The girl's voice joined his, soft and sweet. Please let us in. It's dark out here. We don't like the dark. I squeezed my eyes shut, my teeth clenched. No, couldn't. I wouldn't. Go away. I choked out, my voice trembling. There was silence, and then a soft, almost inaudible sound, a laugh. It was low and breathy, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I could almost see them standing there, grinning at each other, amused by my fear. We'll come back, the boy murmured, his voice a soft sing-song. We always come back. I waited, listening, my heart racing. But after a few minutes, there was nothing. No more knocking, no more voices. Just the steady ticking of the clock on the wall and the low hum of the refrigerator. Slowly, I made my way to the door, peering out through the peephole. The porch was empty. The yard was still. I sagged against the door, relief flooding through me. But I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. I stayed away from home as much as possible, lingering at work long after everyone else had gone home, wandering aimlessly through stores until they closed. But eventually I always had to come back. And every night, just after midnight, they would knock. 3 soft taps. Always 3. Sometimes they whispered to me, their voices drifting through the door, sweet and persuasive. Sometimes they just stood there in silence, their shadows shifting behind the peephole, waiting. I didn't know how much more I could take. The lack of sleep was starting to wear on me. I was jumpy, irritable, snapping at coworkers over nothing. I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye, small shapes darting past windows, pale faces peering out from behind trees. But when I turned to look, there was never anyone there. I knew they were trying to break me down. They were patient, so patient, wearing me down little by little. And it was working. But I still hadn't let them in. Not yet. And then, on the 5th night, they changed their tactics. I had been sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, my mind numb with exhaustion, when I heard it. A new sound. Not knocking this time. Crying. It was a soft, pitiful whimpering, like a small child lost and alone. The kind of sound that tugs at your heart, makes you want to reach out to comfort. Please, the girl sobbed. Please let us in. We're so scared. I closed my eyes, my hands clenched into fists. Don't listen. Don't respond. We just want to come inside, she pleaded. We're not bad. We just want to be safe. There was a muffled sound, a gasp, as if someone had clamped a hand over her mouth. And then the boy's voice, cold and sharp. Stop it. Silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. And then softly, almost tenderly, she won't let us in. A pause. A rustling sound. And then the boy's voice, low and vicious. We'll make her. The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I bolted to my feet, backing away from the door, my heart pounding. Make me? What did that mean? They weren't just trying to scare me. They were planning something, and I had no idea how to stop it. I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for them to wear me down until I slipped up. They had escalated from polite requests to threats, and I didn't want to wait around to see what "make her" really meant. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here anymore. The house felt tainted, like their presence had seeped into every corner, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the walls. I called my boss, told him I needed a few days off, and started packing. I wasn't sure where I would go. A hotel, maybe, or a friend's place. Anywhere but here. But as the day wore on, I felt that familiar dread creeping back in. Even though it was daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, waiting for nightfall. I was in a race against time, and I knew I had to leave before it got dark. By late afternoon, I had crammed as much as I could into my car. I did one last sweep of the house, making sure I hadn't left anything important behind. Just as I was about to head out the door, I hesitated. The note, the crumpled piece of paper they'd left at my door, with those two simple, chilling words, "Missed you," it was still in the pocket of my jacket, tucked away in a drawer. I didn't know why I wanted it. Some sick need for proof, maybe. But I found myself digging through my things until I had it in my hand. I unfolded it slowly, staring at the childlike scrawl. The sight of those words made my stomach twist. I turned it over, almost expecting to see something else. And then I froze. There was something else. In the lower right corner, almost imperceptibly small, was a series of numbers and letters, printed so faintly I had to squint to make them out. 12:00 AM 326 Main Street. My blood ran cold. That was my address. And the time, midnight. Tonight. My fingers trembled as I stared at the paper. Was this a warning? An invitation? It didn't matter. I wasn't going to be here to find out. I shoved the note back into my pocket and bolted out the door, my heart pounding. I didn't even bother locking the house behind me. I just jumped into the car, slammed the door, and peeled out of the driveway. As I sped down the empty street, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. But then I saw them, standing at the corner, right at the edge of the patch of woods near my house, were the children. The boy and the girl. They stood perfectly still, their black eyes following my car as I drove past. The girl's mouth was twisted into that small, eerie smile. The boy raised a hand, almost casually, as if to wave goodbye. I floored the accelerator, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to put as much distance between me and that house as possible. I finally pulled into a motel parking lot on the outskirts of town, my heart still racing, and booked a room for the night. It was dingy and cheap, the kind of place you stay when you don't want to be found. But I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere they couldn't reach me. I locked the door, shoved a chair against it, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. It was 11:45 p.m. I just had to make it through the next 15 minutes. I turned on every light in the room, my eyes darting from window to window. They didn't know where I was. They couldn't. I was safe here. I had to be. But as the minutes ticked by, a horrible realization began to creep over me. They had never needed to know where I was. They just needed to know when. At exactly midnight, the knocking started. 3 soft taps, echoing through the flimsy motel door. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no. Let us in, Sarah." The boy's voice drifted through the door, soft and calm. "It's time." My blood froze. They knew my name. I backed away, my eyes wide, my pulse racing. I was trapped. How had they found me? How could they possibly? "Please let us in." The girl's voice joined his, sweet and sing-song. "We just want to talk. We just want to come inside." I stumbled back, my mind spinning. No, couldn't let them in. No matter what, I had to hold out. Just hold out. We'll be good, the boy promised, his tone soothing. You won't even know we're here. Just let us inside. The words echoed in my head, tugging at me, making it sound so reasonable. So, right, I could feel my resolve crumbling, my thoughts twisting in on themselves. It was just a door, just a few inches of wood. What harm could it do to open it? Just for a second. Just to see them. Stop it! I screamed, clamping my hands over my ears. Go away! They fell silent. For a moment I thought I had won. But then the knob began to rattle. Slowly, deliberately, it twisted back and forth, the metal scraping softly against the wood. My heart pounded in my ears. I backed away, tripping over the edge of the bed, my eyes fixed on that rattling doorknob. And then, without warning, the door burst open. I screamed, scrambling backward, my eyes wide with terror. But the doorway was empty. The hall outside was dark and silent, and the children were nowhere to be seen. I stayed there, trembling, staring at the empty doorway. They were gone, just gone. For a long moment I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, slowly I got to my feet, every nerve on edge. They hadn't come in. Why hadn't they come in? Then I realized I hadn't invited them. The door had opened on its own, but I hadn't spoken the words. I hadn't given permission. Somehow, by some twisted logic of their own, that had been enough to keep them out. For now. But as I stood there, heart racing, I knew I couldn't keep running. They would find me no matter where I went. And eventually I would slip up. I would let them in, unless I ended it. The next morning, I drove straight back to the house. It felt like walking into a graveyard, a place tainted by something dark and malevolent. But I had made up my mind. I packed everything I could into boxes, every possession that meant anything to me. And then I called a realtor. By the end of the day, I had listed the house for sale. I didn't tell her why I was selling. I didn't tell anyone, because how could I explain that my home had become a beacon for something that wasn't supposed to exist? 2 weeks later, I signed the final papers, handed over the keys, and left town. I don't know where I'm going yet. I've moved 3 times in the past month, never staying anywhere for more than a few days. But I haven't seen them again. Not yet. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear soft knocks on the door, or see shadows shifting outside the window. But when I look, there's nothing there. But I know they'll come back. They always come back. And when they do, I'll be ready. Because I'm never letting them in. Not ever. I hope to God I can keep that promise.